So we are now entering the launch phase of the new church. We remember our phases kind of overlap, so it's not one clean break that leads to another. So the launch phase kind of transitions from you've done some preparation work, and now you're starting to do a little bit more specific preparation work. And the launch phase really broken down into pre-launch and then launch. And so we're going to kind of enclose those in the same thing. But this is essentially what we're talking about today in these lectures are the pre-launch activities, what you're doing, just as the question says on the side, what is involved in getting ready to launch a new church. And so remember, our phases really move, progress in overlapping phases and overlapping circles. And so during the envisioning phase, where you're assessing your calling and you're maybe in a residency, or what is God calling you to do, and you're exploring cities and different places, where is God taking you, then you transition at some point into a little more preparation. You've kind of figured out where God is calling you, and then maybe you're doing some vision trips, you're doing some community study, demographic work, maybe you're mapping out the community, some of those type of things to start preparing. And then you move in. In that preparing phase, you actually move to your context, and that preparation phase is usually several months. It's not just a few weeks. It's usually a several month process. Well, the launch phase, as it goes from the preparation to the launch phase, there's kind of like a pre-launch period where your church, your launch team, your core group, you're doing some very specific things to prepare for the start of a new church. And so we're going to kind of transition into those. And one of those things is we're going to discuss today is getting your small groups established. Last week we talked about in the preparation phase, you're moving in and you're making disciples. So you're moving in, you're sharing the gospel. You're, as we discussed with Professor Matt Smith, you're utilizing different ways of doing evangelism depending on what's best for your area. And so now, as you've been sharing the gospel for some time, it's time to start getting those new believers into a small group. And a lot of the discussion today is going to depend on the model or the approach of a church plant that you take. And so, for instance, if you are doing a house church, your launch day may just be the first time that you hold a Bible study in your home with 10 people. Let's say that's what you decide launch day is, even though you may have been doing some other kind of small group studies and maybe meeting with some other individuals or families for some time, but you finally say, okay, on this day, we are doing something specific. We have a specific Bible study. So that launch day is very different. Now, if you're doing a launch large approach where you're focusing a lot on the Sunday morning worship time, which is probably the most common church planting strategy today in North America, is the launch large, where let's try to have 200 to 300 people at the first public worship service. So there's a lot of marketing, a lot of advertising, a lot of community events, a lot of things that go into that, and you get your core team ready. And we'll be looking at some of those ideas here very soon about how do you prepare for launch day. What are some specific things that you do in order to build that momentum? This is kind of like the background. This is to me, starting small groups, as we're discussing today, is really the foundation for getting ready for launch day, no matter what approach you take. Usually you establish we want to launch Easter of 2018. Okay, so usually the most common launch times are either sometime early September. New school year has started, and people kind of reset what they're doing with their year, especially with kids and things. So September is a very popular time, and then Easter is a popular time because Easter is a holiday where even unsaved people know that something religious goes on. And so a lot of times Easter is a great time to start the public worship service as well. Don't recommend the middle of January, especially living in some northern places. It may not, you may have 3 feet of snow on the ground, but you choose your launch time wisely, and each church needs to decide on which is best for them. For us here in Calgary, we're looking at sometime in the spring, close to Easter of 2018. That's when we're hoping to have our first public worship service. But before we get to that, we are now 14 months away from that. And so right now we're in the preparing / pre-launch phase, to where we are starting to evangelize, and we don't have any small groups yet, but we're working towards getting some small groups going here in the next few months as we lead some folks to Christ. And so today we're talking about really starting small groups early on as a church plant. That way, once you get going, you launch, you have several teams, several groups have already been studying the Bible, have been praying together, been building community, been living on mission together. They've already been doing that. And then then once you get a church, your launch going, then they already know how they can be a part of the church because they've already been part of your small groups. And there's different theories and different ways of doing it. We're going to look at some models and approaches here in just a few minutes. But we want to really focus on that today. You've had another lecture on naming your church, logos, branding, all that sort of thing. You had another lecture. We had a conversation with two planters on how they did that. And really, that's kind of just something for you and your church to decide on a name and a logo and that sort of thing. To me, a name, and it's a little bit of sidebar, not really fitting here, but to me, a name. I like the geographically based names. Name them after whatever the community is. Some like more biblically based, like Trinity or Emmanuel Church, something like that. Or they want something a little more creative, like we saw with Collide Church. There's a church up here in Calgary that I'm good friends with a pastor called Connect Church. So there's different names that aren't necessarily biblical or geographically based, but they relate to the mission and vision statements of the church. And so, anyways, that's a little sidebar for you, a little extra from Professor Dustin. So, anyways, let's jump into small groups now. And we want to look familiar. Last week, remember, we talked about making disciples in the new community. And we said church planting is the result of doing the Great Commission of going to where people are to share the good news, baptizing them to a local church family who is on God's mission, teaching them to obey what Christ commanded, especially the Great Commission. So let's translate that now over into starting discipleship groups or small groups in the new community. So church planting is the result of doing the Great Commission together. Okay, so now we've gone from just doing it to now we're doing it together, of going together where people are to share the good news, baptizing or connecting new believers to a church small group who is on God's mission, and teaching the group to obey what Christ commanded, especially the Great Commission. So we're still seeing that the result of church planting is that we're making disciples, and as we see in Scripture, as the disciples were made, they were gathered into groups of various sizes, and they comprised the church in that city. And we know that 2,000 years ago, in different contexts, different time, different leadership, that they looked a little bit different. But in our time now, we get the opportunity in the 21st century, is that what we're in now? Yeah, 21st century, we get to decide what church looks like best for us now, according, still following biblical principles, but we have a new context now. And so we discussed this last week as well. How do you make, mature, and multiply disciples? Well, we talked about exegeting, learn the people in your context to know how to be all things to all people. You evangelize, you share the gospel intentionally, relationally, and continually. Then you equip, you disciple new believers to obey Christ through a discipleship pathway. Now, let's translate that to small groups. How do you start new small groups in a new context? You do the same thing. You exegete. Learn how people in your context get together to build community. Find out what is it that brings people together in small groups. Now, there are small groups happening all over your city, in your community, all over the place. They're hobby-based. There may be rec leagues up here. A lot of small groups are hockey teams. A lot of the adults and kids are part of hockey leagues and various things. And so those type of indoor sport leagues are really big up here. So those are small groups. They're already getting together. Our local grocery store actually does cooking classes. So my wife and I want to go to a few of those just to kind of see are there some regulars who come. So your communities already have small groups that get together. They just have a different purpose. So you want to learn what is it that is bringing people together, and how can you either mirror that or be a part of that, or as you're starting your small groups, make it to where it feels very comfortable and very normal to those folks who God has brought you because of what they've already been doing in their community. Then you evangelize, you share the gospel intentionally, relationally, and continually as a group, two groups. So now as you're getting more, you get several new disciples, you're teaching them how to obey the Great Commission, live the Great Commission as a group. You're doing it together. So now your small group all join a hockey league, or they all join a cooking class together, for instance, and then they're learning how to share the gospel and build relationships as well while you're doing it as a group. So you're not just doing it individually, but now you're also doing it as a group. And then you're equipping them, discipling believers to obey Christ and lead small groups of their own. And so you're equipping them to do the same. And so how you make disciples, you exegete, evangelize, equip. How you start new small groups, you do the same thing. You exegete, you evangelize, and then you equip. So we talked about this discipleship pathway last week in our last session, but how could your group make mature and multiply disciples? Well, I'd say your small group leaders oversee the group using a discipleship pathway tool. And so keep that in mind, that this discipleship pathway really is best done when there's someone who is keeping the group accountable. And so I think small groups, and this is why I believe it's so important to start this from the very beginning, as you're making disciples and you're getting them into a pathway. You see, our pathway starts from their lost going to leading, starts with gospel conversations, and there's their conversion, their baptism, and that connecting time is when you're really connecting them with other believers. You're connecting them one-on-one so they can be discipled. You may be connecting them with small groups. And so we're really focusing on that time in the pathway for your new believers. And this is early on, because sometimes the connecting actually happens before their conversion. They get connected to a small group Bible study of some sort, and then they become a follower of Christ, and they convert and are baptized. And so a lot of times this connecting is actually happening a lot sooner. But you see, this is very early on in the pathway, and I think it's essential. I think that the discipleship pathway works best in the context of small group environments. So let's look at some scripture, and let's see some of the environments that we see, especially from the book of Acts and forward, on some environments for small group discipleship and what they look like. In Acts 2:46, first part, it says, "Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple complex and broke bread from house to house." So right here you see two environments that are happening there together in the temple complex, which the temple complex was a normal place for the Jews to gather for Sabbath, for worship, with the priests and those type of things. So that was a normal practice where the early church was still meeting together in that temple complex. It was almost like a larger group gathering. But they also broke bread. Many would translate that as doing communion together, and I would see that as probably dinner with communion type thing. But they broke bread from house to house. So there's also a smaller environment. So you have the temple complex, big environment, and house to house, smaller environment. We see both of them happening. Acts 5:42, every day in the temple complex and the various homes, they continue teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. Here again, you see two different environments, a larger environment and a home, smaller environment. Acts 16:1-3, after the synagogue had been dismissed, and this is, I shortened it a little bit. After the synagogue had been dismissed, many of the Jews and devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who were speaking with them and persuading them to continue in the grace of God. The following Sabbath, almost the whole town assembled to hear the message of the Lord. So here you have a larger group, even the whole town is getting together. Okay, so this is even a larger environment, just a small church gathering, but even the city is now an environment for discipleship. Acts, what is that? Sorry, that might be the wrong reference. I think I copy and paste that wrong. Anyways, I think this one is 16. Yeah, that is something that ends with 44. I just looked that up. That's not Acts 16. This is Acts 16. Sorry about that. My copy and paste, I didn't change. I'll find that scripture and correct it later. And this is Acts 16 when we meet with Timothy. He was in another environment. So we have the city, we have the temple complex, synagogue, and then we have house to house. Then he went on to learn. This is talking about Paul. Then Paul, went on to Derbe and Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke highly of him. Paul wanted Timothy to go with him. As they traveled through the towns, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and the elders at Jerusalem for them to observe. Remember the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15, where they had to decide, can these Gentiles be part of the church? So they're delivering this. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. So here's the smallest environment where Paul wanted this one young man who had a lot of capability, a lot of talent, a lot of potential to go with him. So this was even a smaller discipleship environment where it's almost a one-on-one. Now, we knew that Paul was traveling in a team, so Timothy was part of a small team. But as we know through the rest of Scripture, especially in the book of 1st and 2nd Timothy, Paul really had a deep interest in discipling and mentoring and raising up Timothy to be a leader. And he took over one of the churches that Paul had planned, I think in was it Ephesus? I can't remember. But anyways, here we see another environment. So there's a city environment, but the most common we have are the temple complex, synagogue environment, the house-to-house environment, and now this one-on-one environment. So let's see, even in 1 Corinthians 16:19, as Paul is closing the letter, it says, Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in the Lord, along with the church that meets in their home. And Paul, in several of his letters, Philemon is actually ended with something very similar. We're talking about he actually greets them to the church in their house. And so we see that there's different environments where discipleship is taking place. And we see Jesus did the same thing. Through Jesus' life, his ministry is three and a half years or so of making disciples of his public ministry, we saw that he had a ministry to not only the masses, he had crowds. And sometimes it was the 5,000 who was feeding, sometimes it was a few hundred who were listening to the group who was at the Sermon on the Mount. So he had these masses that were following him, and some of them were following him from city to city. And then when he'd go to a new place, people would hear, oh, Jesus is in town, and they wanted to go hear what he had to say. And so his largest group were the masses, where he did a lot of public preaching and teaching and healing and other type of miracles. But then he narrowed it down, though, to the 12. There were 12 disciples, 12 men that he invested in very intentionally to raise them up to be the next leaders. And we know from the book of Acts that 11 of these 12, and then of course they added Matthias, who Matthias was probably included in the masses, as he was probably one who followed them around a lot more than most of the other masses. But anyways, so you had the 11 and plus Matthias, and then finally 12 in Acts. And in Acts, I think it's Acts 17, they are accused of turning the world upside down. So Jesus' small group worked. All right, but then you also see that there is an intentional focus on Peter, James, and John, especially Peter. Okay, and so you can almost say that Peter was Jesus' kind of one-on-one, but he had 3 of the disciples that he just intentionally did a lot more with. And we see in Scripture, especially in the book of Acts, who is it that preaches the very first sermon of Pentecost? It was Peter, who leads the church in Jerusalem, who does all these things, and who was the most known apostle in the Judea, Samaria area. It was Peter. Paul was most known outside of Judea and Samaria, as he went on to the rest of the Roman Empire, on into Rome and hopefully into Spain. But we see that those 3, Peter, James, and John, were the 3 that Jesus just really invested a lot in. And so even Jesus had different environments, different groups, and he contextualized, he fit how he was discipling each group depending on who was there. And so he spent some very intimate time with Peter, especially after his denial of him. He spent some very intimate time with him, forgiving him. He spent a lot of time with the 12, teaching parables and taking them aside and saying, okay, you heard the parable, now let's understand it. Let me explain it to you further. And so in the masses, of course, he is preaching the good news of the kingdom, that they should repent and be baptized. And so we see even Jesus had different discipleship groups. Let's compare that with what we have today. Our church has different discipleship groups as well. We have public worship service, and this is a general. And if you have a house church, this is a little bit different. But for the most part, in general, we have a larger public worship service, which is for discipleship. It's for worship of God, and it's also discipling as the people in the congregation are listening to a gospel-centered sermon. They are applying Scripture to their life. They're growing in their faith. They're learning. They're seeing how they can better, as a larger group, be on mission together. And so the worship service is a larger discipleship environment. Within most churches, I would say almost all, have some type of small group ministry, whether it's a Sunday school, whether it's home groups, whether it's missional communities, whatever it is. Most churches, by and large, have some type of small group ministry where they take from the larger worship gathering, from the larger body, and they break people down into smaller groups, usually age-based or affinity-based or geographically based or something. They get them into smaller groups for a little bit more intimate discipleship. And then you have groups of 2 to 3s, where there's some one-on-one discipleship, some one-on-2 discipleship happening. Now, sadly, it is the smaller circle that usually gets the least amount of attention. If you were to survey your church and find out how many people in your church are discipling intentionally one person, at least one person on a weekly basis outside of the church, not part of Sunday school, not part of the home group, or just they're discipling one other person just a little more intimately, I would say it's probably in the single digits as far as percentage. It's just not something that our people are kind of scared of, and they say, well, the church can handle that, the pastors handle that, the Sunday school teacher handle that. But I really believe that we need to have a balance of doing the worship service well, small groups well, and doing our 2 to 3 smaller discipleship groups as well. But this mirrors what Jesus did, and so I think our churches should do the same. So let's discuss now about choosing a small group format. There's different kinds of small groups, and I want to give you just really a general overview, and I'm going to list some names of writers and practitioners who you could look up and maybe get some of their books. So all the ones that I've listed, I've read at least something of them related to this content. And so I'm by no means the expert on any of these, but I have read kind of broadly on some of the small group things. And so what I've done is I summarized each of these five and kind of gave some strength and weaknesses. We'll see that in a second. But I want you to pay attention to the names. If you find one, I really want to know more about life transformation groups, then you need to research Neil Cole and look up some of his writings and things, and I can even help point you to some of those. So the five, these are, again, generalized, okay? But the five small group formats, I guess, are the most common or the best summation of them. First are called life transformation groups. Second, Sunday schools, life or community groups, cell groups, and missional communities. Okay, so let's talk about each of those, because as you're either you're excuse me, I'm burping at my breakfast. Odd. Whether you're launching a brand new church plant from scratch, or you're replanting a church, or even revitalizing a church, knowing which is the best small group format for your church is really vital. This is all is dependent on how you're wired as a leader, who God has brought you, and their wirings, their giftings, and also the context. What's the best for your area, and which fits your church planning model, your approach the best. And so choosing a small group format is essential. If you are an established church, you may be doing small groups one way and they're just not working. You're trying to revitalize, and you may need to retool or rethink how you do your small groups. I'll give you, for instance, our sending church from Winston-Salem, Calvary Baptist, have what they call Bible Fellowship, which is essentially Sunday school. They're meeting classrooms on Sunday morning. They have their own teacher. So it's Sunday school. They just call it a different name. But this last year, they started asking some of their Bible fellowships to start meeting off the church campus on a different night, maybe in people's homes. First of all, they needed more volunteers for Sunday morning. A lot of their kids ministry is rapidly growing, so they need more volunteers. And so they say, well, if your Sunday school class, your Bible fellowship class, isn't meeting on Sunday morning, maybe the 15 or 20 in your class could then take that time to be their volunteer time, and then maybe Sunday evening or Thursday evening or some other time your group meets. You can come meet on campus. We'll open up the building for you. You can come and meet in your classroom on Monday night. That's completely fine. Or you can go meet in someone's home. And so they had a good number, about 7 or 8 of their Sunday school classes, their Bible fellowships, actually started doing that. So they increased their volunteers for Sunday morning, but it also got some of their groups off of the campus to where they could mingle with their neighbors a little bit more. And so we started hearing some stories this last fall of Bible fellowships that were starting to do dinner together on Monday night and doing their lesson and things together, and they were inviting their lost neighbors to dinner, and they were sticking around for the Bible study. And so that's an example of a church that's kind of in a revitalization period where they're rechanging a lot of their things. That was one way they're starting to shift. Now, they're not planning to get rid of Sunday school. They just want to have multiple options for how to live out small group life. So anyway, that's just an example of an existing church that's applying some of this idea that we're talking about today. So let's go through each of these 5 briefly. The first, we have life transformation groups. So Neil Cole is kind of the house church guru. If you read anything, he talks a lot about organic church. He writes a lot about life transformation groups. His book, Search and Rescue, is actually the one that I first encountered the life transformation group idea. I believe he wrote a little more in depthly about it in another book. I can't remember the name, but he does talk a lot about them in the book Search and Rescue. But life transformation groups are very small groups of 2 to 3 people. Okay, so this is the smallest of the small group model as far as number of people who gather often to discuss Scripture, ask accountability questions to measure spiritual health, and are expected to multiply when 3 are in one group. Okay, so the strengths of this, there's a heavy focus on Scripture. Neil Cole even describes that they would try to read a whole book of the Bible in the week and then discuss it the next week. So they would read the book of Romans and say, okay, we meet Monday morning for coffee. So by next Monday morning, you need to have read the whole book of Romans, and we're going to discuss what you've read. And then they would come back the next week and they would discuss some things, and he said, we realized, man, there's more to discuss. Let's read it through again. He said sometimes they would read the single book a dozen times and just keep discussing. They were so saturated in Scripture that they understood the book of Romans very well by the time that they had gone through it. And then they would move on to another book, or it was time, okay, you go start one. So there's a big focus on Scripture, accountability. Because it's intimate one-on-one, sometimes one-on-two, with 2 or 3 people together, you can do a lot more deeper accountability. These are usually gender-based, And so men with men, women with women. So the men can ask each other accountability questions. How are you staying pure in your relationship with your wife? How is your anger? I know you have a lot of pride issues. You're struggling with this at work. How are you working through that? So there's a lot of accountability that can go on because there's such a small group. It's very, very intimate. It's the most intimate format of small group. And it's also a low bar for leadership to multiply. Now, don't hear low bar as that is unqualified people. It's not that. It's just that in life transformation groups, because this is typically a house church approach for a small group. So a house church is a small group meeting in a home. So this is almost the house church's version of a small group. Is essentially what a life transformation group is. And so the low bar for leadership basically says we don't need you to go through 2 years of training and being an assistant leader for a year, and then go through all these things and get approved by the elders or the pastors or deacons or whichever, and then you can become a life transformation group leader. After just a few months of reading scripture and asking accountability questions with someone who is a little bit more mature of a Christian, then you grab one of the person, you do the same thing with them. And the evangelistic intent is that you invite a lost person to do that. But most often it's usually someone else in the church, maybe someone new to the church. This is the same idea as fight clubs. We touched on this in our previous class on disciple making from our textbook, Gospel Centered Discipleship. And this is essentially a fight club idea where some churches have a larger worship gathering, have some type of small group, and then they have what they call fight clubs or life transformation groups. It's just groups of 2 to 3. But I like the idea of the LTG Life Transformation Group better than Fight Club. So there's a low bar for leadership in the sense that they don't have to go through a lot of hoops. You've done this, it's time for you to start. So it's actually very easy to multiply these groups. The weaknesses, though, that some of the life transformation group idea is that they can become more inward than outward oriented. And so we experienced that at a church, Jill and I did. It was a church that was trying to get life transformation groups started that were another subset of their small groups. And in a lot of ways, it kind of felt like they were adding another thing for us to do, another thing for people to do. So they didn't have a lot of good traction with it. But they had, a good, maybe 10-50% of the church that were involved. But they were also very, they seemed kind of very inward oriented. The idea was go and find someone else in the church to do this with. And so we were asking, well, why not do it with an unsaved person? So sometimes they can be very inward focused because you develop this intimate relationship with this person. You get to know them for so many months. And then why do you want to split off after, 6, 7, 8 months? You really got to know them. They know your deepest, darkest secrets. They've been praying with you to battle this in for years, or not years, but months. So sometimes it can be more inward than outward oriented. Not all the ways, but sometimes it can. And it can be a little odd for outsiders to come. When you're one-on-one and then you bring them into a very intimate group where the very first time this lost person comes in and they sit down in the coffee shop or in your home, and here you are with your friend Jamie, and you and Jamie have been talking about scripture, and then you start asking accountability questions. You get into some deep kind of simple stuff, and here's your lost friend saying, no, I didn't sign up for this. And so sometimes it can be kind of intimidating for an outsider because of the level of intimacy. Now, it's not bad for them to see that. They need that too. But sometimes the life transformation group may not be the best entryway into that kind of relationship. But sometimes you have an outsider who just really wants to learn about the Christian faith. They jump right in, and it works great. So in final analysis, I think the LTGs are great as an extension of house church. I think if your context demands that you do a house church approach, do it well. And I would see life transformation groups as a great way for your house church to be able to do some type of small group ministry. The next one is Sunday school. So we're very familiar with Sunday school, and I would highly recommend anything from Tom Rainer and Lifeway about Sunday school. Mostly I'm familiar with this because I am a Southern Baptist, and so Lifeway is our main publisher. They, all my life almost, I've used some type of Lifeway curriculum either when I was in middle school and high school at a Southern Baptist church, and we were using the Lifeway team material to the Lifeway material that I used teaching in the Sunday school that I was youth pastor. And so we used several of Lifeway's curriculum things, and they have some really, really great material that can actually be used for Sunday school classes, small groups, missional communities. They're very, they kind of cross over to all kinds of different formats. They're very general. But Lifeway really is focused on continuing to build strong Sunday schools. The vast majority of Southern Baptist churches still do your traditional Sunday school. So they provide a lot of really great resources. I would highly recommend looking into anything that Lifeway has. Tom Rainer's done some writing on it. So has some of his staff. Ed Stetzer used to be on his staff, and so he had helped with some writing a book called Transformational Small Groups, Transformational Discipleship, and then Eric Geiger, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, but he's written a little bit about Sunday school as well. But I would recommend anything from Tom Rainer in Lifeway's group. But Sunday school, as you mostly familiar with, is a small group of various sizes that typically meet at the church's facilities and use a structured curriculum approved by the church. So that's very central there, that they meet at the church's facilities. It's very building centric. Okay, if there's a classroom. We know that there's many churches. I grew up in church that had an education wing. That education wing was basically 2 floors of classrooms, and bottom floor were kids in nursery, and the upper floor were teens, young adults, and different things. And so we're very familiar with Sunday school, and I think they're still very valid. I know a lot of new church plants are kind of shying away from Sunday school. Most churches that are being planted are going to some type of home group model where they're meeting in homes and not a building. A lot of that is because there's no facility for Sunday school, so it'd be very tough to do Sunday school without having a building suited for it. So that's why they're very building centric. The strengths of Sunday school, that there's a focus on learning the Bible. Every week there is a biblical lesson from the text, or from a very solid curriculum, hopefully. It's age grade appropriate, and so your child or your teenager, you as a young adult or a senior adult, you're learning with peers, and the material is often age graded as well. So I really love the churches that use a Sunday school curriculum that is the same lesson, but it's different for every age group. So let's say you're all studying the story of David and Goliath, where your 2-year-old has their own version of that story that they learn in their Sunday school class, and you have yours as well, and so does your teenager. So in that way, at Sunday lunch or during that week, you can actually discuss what you learned in Sunday school because you all had it at your appropriate level. It's another strength that is a standardized curriculum that is easy for all types of teachers. And so when you have a teacher who is, I can't write my own Bible lesson, I can't really come up with something, I'm not a pastor, I can't do a sermon. Well, you have a curriculum that's easy for them to follow. And that's what really, I found this a strength for our Sunday school when I was at youth pastor at Bethany Baptist. We had a curriculum, and we had leaders who were good teachers, but they were just super busy. They worked 70 hours a week, so they didn't have time to write their own lessons. So we all agreed and found a really strong curriculum. It was one from Lifeway, and we all liked it, and we did some samples of it. And we agreed that there were 5 of us teachers. We all liked it, so we started using it. So that way, all of my teachers, no matter their gifting, their strength, or their time they can put into it, they all had something that they could use. They all had a good, solid curriculum that would help them. And so it was easy for our teachers to use. And I think Sunday school also one of the strengths that it pairs well with a program-based church model. If your church is one that has a facility and likes to do a lot of programs outside from your facility, then I think the Sunday school is really one of the best ways, because you have a building, why not use it? Okay. And if your church membership are already kind of used to a lot of the programs and things that build community, that build discipleship, that go out on mission, program is not bad. You can over-program and really just fill in time for people, or you can be very strategic with your programming and see it as a Great Commission tool. And so I think it pairs well with a program-based church model because you have facility and you've got kind of the program culture that really fits with that. So I think that's a great strength of the Sunday school model. Some of the weaknesses, this is people, I used to be very angry at the concept of Sunday school just because some of the ones that I grew up with just didn't seem to be that good. Not because the teachers didn't like us, but I just don't remember getting a lot out of some of those. But many are really opposed to Sunday school, and I'm not nearly as opposed as I used to be. I actually think that Sunday school probably needs to come back in a lot of ways, in a lot of contexts, simply because I think it's a really good approach depending on your church plant and where you are. But anyway, some of the weaknesses, it can be more inward than outward oriented because it is in a building, and most likely lost people aren't going to walk by your church on a Sunday morning and walk into your Sunday school class. Just not that common. There's a lot more intentionality that has to happen to bring a lost person into a Sunday school group. And what we found with our Sunday school is that at our church, we found more of the evangelistic opportunities were happening when we were encouraging our Sunday school classes to maybe once a month do a dinner together or go to a restaurant or do something together outside the church. And that's when they started being able to invite others into that group. But more often than not, it's easy to do things in a room with a curriculum with people sitting in rows. It's not easy to bring in lost people. It can often often be building centered to where the church. What happens if the church loses its building? Then what are they going to do for Sunday school? And so, God forbid that fire or some other kind of natural disaster wipes out a church facility. Well, how will the church do small groups? They would have to go to some type of home group model or something for a while. They can still do their Sunday school, but oftentimes it's so building centered that it kind of stifles creativity of how they can do some other things. And it's not always as welcoming to outsiders, as we mentioned with it's more inward than outward oriented. Sometimes outsiders aren't just going to walk in. They don't feel quite as welcome walking into a class, but maybe they would if you had intentionally built a relationship with them and brought them in with you. So even the weaknesses just really require more of an intentionality, not just a weakness in the actual structure. And I would say, as far as analysis, Sunday school is great for churches with adequate facilities in a context with a lot of new believers not accustomed to it. So where I'm from, in the southeast U.S. in North Carolina, almost every church is doing Sunday school except for the handful of new church plants. And so Sunday school is a normal thing. Even lost people know it. If they grew up in North Carolina and they don't know Christ, they have some idea of Sunday school. Either they were dragged there as a kid by grandma, or they at least know something about it. What if you're in a brand new context? I'm even thinking for us here in Calgary, it's a context that's really not used to church stuff anymore. Sunday school is like, okay, what is this? Well, it may be best in your context to actually start a Sunday school. If God blesses your new church plant with a building, it might be really good to do a Sunday school, because it actually might be that they're not used to it, so it's new to them. Oh, I get to come to the building, and I get to my small group time and the worship time together in one. I have a really busy schedule. So really, Sunday school for really, really busy working people is actually a great way to do it, but you have to have a facility for it. And so that's the struggle, and that's the tension for a lot of new church plants. They don't have the building to do that, and so they choose more of a home group model. Let's move on to the next. Life community groups. So this is probably the most common among new church plants. You call them life groups, community groups, home groups. There's many different names for it, but life and community groups seem to be the two more common. And Eric Geiger, he's a writer and works at Lifeway as well. He's done some good writing. He co-authored a book, Simple Church, with Tom Rainer, that really does kind of explore how many churches were no longer doing a Sunday night service or a Wednesday night service or a Sunday school. They'd have Sunday morning worship and then life groups or home groups meeting sometime during the week at someone's house. So he really kind of started writing a lot about this, but a lot of churches are doing this. If you look at any new church plant in your community, most likely is using some type of life group or community group. Some call them, they have different names for them based on their church. So we were part of Rebo Church for a while. In Winston-Salem, they call their R groups. So same kind of concept and idea, but it is a format. So a life or community group is essentially a small group of 5 to 20 people that typically meet weekly in a member's home as an extension of the church. They're either geographically, relationally, or affinity based. And so that as an extension of the church is key. They see themselves as we are basically almost like the Sunday school class that is a part of the larger church, but we're on a small unit. We're an extension. We just have to meet at home. And so they're an extension of the church, and they're usually geographically based. Everyone who lives in this side of town, they kind of get together, or they're relationally based. You have a lot of relationships, and you bring people in from different places, but your group stays together based on the relationships you already have. Or they're affinity based. Men's group, young single adult group, college group. Their affinity, they're based on something that is around their season of life or their age or something. I think some of the strengths of this format is to focus on discussing the Bible and applying it to life. So because they're meeting at home, they often have dinner together, they can really discuss the text and apply it. And a lot of life groups and community groups do sermon-based discussion. So the pastor will put together some discussion questions based on the sermon from Sunday morning, and the group will discuss the text, answer those questions. So it's kind of reinforcing the ideas of the sermon, but also letting some individual application happen as a group discusses it, and then they can help keep each other accountable. Pastor preached about praying. How are we doing in our prayer life? And they can discuss it together as a group. So I think that's one of the great strengths of it, that there is a focus on discussing the Bible and applying it, not just hearing a lesson. and as in some other formats. It's good at building community among believers. Some of those life community groups, they stick together for a while. They build really strong, good community. Maybe some of you have been a part of that, where you just really felt like that was your family in a way. They really talk about sharing life together, and so they do things outside of the small group time often. And maybe some of the moms get their kids together for play dates. Some of the dads go hunting together or play some sports together, or they have one couple has another couple over for dinner that's outside of this group time. So you kind of do life and share life together. Is a very common phrase that you'll hear. It's not dependent on a building. That's one of the best strengths, I think, is that you can do a life group anywhere. You can do it at a coffee shop. You can do it down at a rec center, in a little meeting room. You can do it really anywhere. You can do it under the willow tree in Grandpa's backyard. Okay, it's not dependent on a building, and so that's why many church plants utilize this format. It's because most new churches do not start with enough money to buy a building. They usually start with having to rent a facility or something else, and this usually doesn't have enough room for a Sunday school. And so, because they're not dependent on a building, they can remain fluid. And if the Sunday morning meeting location needs to change, the home groups don't need to change at all, because they're just meeting in someone's home. Another strength is really good at raising up new leaders and utilizing gifts. And so in a life group, you'd have some who are, this person is our hospitality person. They're in charge of hosting to make sure dinner is kind of organized and planned. This person is doing our teaching. Some life groups do like a worship singing time, so this person does that. This person organizes our serving opportunities, our mission opportunities. So you have different people in the small group who are leading in different capacities. And then some of those are able at some point, as they do it well in their small group, they may even start leading it for the whole church because they've done it well in their group. And maybe they start coaching other life groups on how to do some of these things. So it's really good at raising up new leaders and then getting them kind of into a leadership pipeline, so to speak, to be able to use their gifts well. Some of the weaknesses, it can become unbalanced in mission as you're getting together and building that strong community and fellowship. Mission becomes like a every other month service project instead of a lifestyle. Community can become unbalanced in mission community formation if the leaders aren't intentional. I didn't read the whole thing. And so sometimes you would have more community and less mission. You'd have a lot of formation but less mission. Usually in life groups, the mission part is the part that is off balance, because usually mission is more of, have you shared the gospel lately, not let's go together and share the gospel together. So, but I think a life group that really works intentionally to balance all of these can really do well. And really getting those back to balance really just looks at your rhythm. Maybe 1 week we do a sermon-based discussion, and the next week we are out somewhere together connecting with a different group in the city. We're joining a hockey league, for instance. We're joining some type of other small group, and in an evangelistic sense. So every other week, and that kind of helps build balance. So you're doing mission 1 week, formation the other week, all the time building community. So those are just some ideas on kind of getting those back in balance instead of just a weekly Bible study. It can be tough to break up the group to multiply because they build such strong community and love for each other. It can be hard to break them up when it's time the group is now 20 and our little apartment can't fit 20 people anymore. We need to do 2 groups of 10 and they can grow to 20 and keep multiplying and so forth. But it can just be tough. And the way to combat this is from early on, you build a culture of, yes, we multiply, and yes, that's tough. But as you do it and you kind of warn them beforehand that, yes, you're going to build some strong relationships, but in a year, we hope that half your group leads us to our new group, so to speak. Then you can kind of soften some of that, and it's not as hard. But you still get to do things together as part of the larger body. But when they say that it's for the purpose of mission, not for the purpose of themselves, a lot of people are just more than happy to break up their group because it leads to more people knowing Christ. And the last weakness, worship service is often the front door. And so what you will have is the church will have you sign up for a life group or community group. And so usually it's come to Sunday morning and we'll plug you into a life group instead of you came to a life group, come join us Sunday morning. And so that's not a huge weakness. Most churches do a both and. Because you're not going to tell a person, oh, don't come through here. But some life community groups are kind of closed to the outside. So they want you to come to the church first, and then they will plug you in or help connect you with a good group that fits you well. Whereas the reverse of that is people who are coming into the group, such as the missional community we'll look at in a second, and come into the group, and then they become part of the larger church worship service. So as a final analysis, I would say it's great for mobile churches with strong preaching, because you have good sermon-based discussion, good leadership development systems, know how to use everyone's gifting and how to help take them to the next level, and a clear vision for their small groups. Do they have a clear vision of how they want them to multiply, how they want them to be led? So if you have those things, that you're a mobile church with strong preaching, good leadership development systems, and a clear small group vision, I think life community groups is a great approach for you. Two more left. Cell groups. Joel Comiskey. You may not have heard of Joel Comiskey. And cell groups are something that we've seen actually explode in places like South Korea and some other international contexts, and not as much here in the U.S., but I think it's a very, very great format. It's actually kind of the foundational format for the last one, missional community, which we'll look at in a second. But cell groups, and Joel Comiskey is kind of the guru behind the cell group idea. He's been writing for probably about 15, 20 years about just the idea of cell groups. And I have 2 or 3 of his books that are really good. So a cell group is a small group of 3 to 15 that meet weekly outside the church facility and view themselves more as a micro church than a small group. So here's the nuanced difference between a cell group and a life or community group. A cell group really, the church leadership actually gives a cell group the autonomy, some autonomy to do things on their own that the larger church would do. For instance, some cell groups would do their own communion. So instead of doing it together as a corporate body, each cell group is required or is asked to actually do communion. Some of them even do their own baptism. So they're almost like a micro church, but they see themselves as, this is our kind of house church during the week, and then on Sunday morning we get together for a celebration service. So you will hear a lot of times, you can almost kind of pinpoint and pick out a cell group based church if they call their Sunday morning the celebration service, because they see the cell group more as what church is, and then Sunday morning is just celebrating what God's been doing through the groups and through people's lives. And then there's preaching and worship and everything else, but it's more of a celebration service where they bring all those groups together. And so that's just kind of a nuanced difference, but it is a difference because, as we'll see here in the strengths, the cell group is as important as the gathered church. And so, and I like that. I think that's a very valid strength. I think I think if you have the right leader, a cell group can be very healthy and very good when it is seen as important as the gathered church. Because sometimes it's, we have 100 people for Sunday morning worship, 60 in our small groups, and 15, 20 in our discipleship groups. Why aren't 100 people in the small groups? Why is it only 60% or 50%? Well, in the cell group, when you see the cell is just as important as the larger body, you have as many or more people. You may have 120 people who are in different cell groups throughout the week and 100 who are coming for worship. That's a very common thing with cell groups because they see the cell as church. So a lot of people say, well, this is my church, is actually my cell group more than it. That's a weakness, I think, in some, because like we say in the weaknesses, it can confuse newcomers on what is church. But I think if you do it well and have good leadership, I think the cell group, seeing themselves as just important as the gathered church, is actually a strength. Cell leaders take on pastoral responsibilities. And I think this is a strength because it relieves the pastors and the other elders of some of the bigger picture. So instead of making hospital visits to everyone in the church, each cell group leader is kind of the pastor, and they can visit their own person, their own member who is in the hospital. It's something very, very serious. Of course, the pastors will come and visit, but it kind of gives a little bit more. It's almost like the cell group leader is the first pastor you talk to, and if it's a really big thing, you take it to the next pastor, basically. But it's really nice that they take on a little more pastoral responsibility, and so a lot of cell groups really have the elder qualifications from 1 Timothy as the requirements for a cell group leader. Another strength that is really good at building community among believers, really good at building that kind of community feel. It keeps families together. And so in Sunday school, families are often separated. That's one of the weaknesses we didn't mention, but families are often separated during that discipleship time, whereas life groups and cell groups, even missional communities, really do try to keep families together. And so you have kids and adults mingling, so it's multi-generational, which I think is a great strength. Another strength that is good at raising up new leaders, and they are multiplication oriented. They build a culture of multiplying from the very beginning. Your cell group will split into 2 by the end of this year. That's expected. And so I think that's a really good strength. Some of the weaknesses, it can confuse newcomers on what is church. Well, is church the Sunday morning, or is it the Tuesday night group that I'm a part? Which is church? So a cell group would say we both are. We're different expressions, and we're together, though we're kind of separate in some sense. So it can be confusing. I think here the best way to combat this is just good language, really good explanation to a new person. Oh, here's what we do here, and here's why we do it in the small group time, and then here's what it looks like for Sunday morning. I think if you really just do well to educate newcomers from the very beginning, I think that softens that confusion a lot. Potential for power struggles. Anytime you have a cell group leader who is the pastor of their smaller group, they may try to think things are, needs to be their way. So the bigger church elders really need to have an eye and keep a pulse on all of their cell group leaders. So there could be some potential for power struggles. And another weakness, and this is more coming from the reading that I've done in Comiskey's stuff and some other cell group things, some of the articles and books, that it seems like evangelism is not the group's responsibility, but only the individual. So the cell group doesn't see itself as a cell group on mission, but during that cell group time, they will say, how are you sharing the gospel? Who are the 3 lost friends that we can be praying for that you are investing in right now? So it's almost an accountability for the individual, but it's not we are as a group are going together to do some things. So I think that could be a weakness, though it's not the end, because if they're still if you have individuals sharing the gospel and evangelizing, it can be just as effective as the group doing it. I'm just a big advocate for the groups doing it together. So in final analysis for a cell group, great for multiplying churches that have good leadership development systems. And I don't know what my last thought was going to be, but anyways, it was late making this PowerPoint. I think it's great for multiplying churches that have good leadership development systems and are willing to let these other groups kind of see themselves in a little more autonomy. I think that's where I was going with that. Let's get to our last one. Let's do it kind of briefly. Missional communities. So Jonathan Dodson I think he's in Austin, Texas. We also used one of his books, Great Gospel-Centered Discipleship, in a previous class. He's done some other books and writing on missional communities. His church, actually, I think they switched from their previous format to a more missional community format. So he has a lot of good insight on that. And Mike Breen with 3DM, he is a missional community guru in a lot of ways. And he's the one that says, you see the definition of small group of 10 to 50. He would say that a missional community is actually almost like a microcosm, micro church in a sense of 2 or 3 small groups who see themselves as a missional community as part of a large. It's a little bit different idea. I don't really care for going that big with it, but he had a really good field guide for actually developing and starting a missional community. It's really good. So missional community is essentially a small group of 10 to 50 people that become an extended family of the church and develop their own unique rhythm and calendar. So the difference in the missional community versus like a life or community group is that they see themselves more of it as an extended family, and instead of just the rhythm of being every Monday night we meet at Bob's home for Bible study, they really work intentionally to build in a kind of a unique calendar throughout the week, to where not every week they meet together. Sometimes it's some of them doing a running club on Tuesday evenings, while some others are doing this. Then the next week they do get together for a dinner party type thing. So it's a little bit more, I don't want to say messy, but there's a little bit more to it as far as how they schedule things. So the rhythm is a lot different because they see it as we're an extended family. And a family doesn't just get together on Monday nights for dinner. Families do a lot of things together. They work together. They play together. They share things together. They go shopping together. So you see a missional community has a lot more holistic involvement than the other formats. And this is really what separates them. A missional community is essentially a cell group that has included some mission mess, I would say. And so the missional community is essentially a cell group that's doing a little bit more. Some of the strengths, I think, of the missional community model, that they do a really good job at balancing gathering and scattering. So they see gathering on Sunday morning as very important, and scattering for mission as a group as very important. Missional community leaders take on pastoral responsibilities, just like in a cell group. Many missional community-based churches actually require that the missional community leader be a qualified elder of the church, or a qualified pastor. Lay pastor, not paid, but they have to meet this qualification to go through like an ordination type process. Another strength that it builds community for everyone, whereas here the cell group strength is building community among believers. For missional communities, it's really good at building community for everyone. So missional communities are really good for including lost people together. they're really good because you're doing different things. You're not just doing a 2-hour Bible study each week or a sermon-based discussion. Because you're doing all these other things, there's multiple ways that your lost friends and neighbors can be included in the life of the missional community, because not everything you do is a Bible study time. And so, for instance, I led a missional community at our church in Winston for about 2 years. We started one at Wake Forest, and our church called them gospel communities with the same idea. And we would meet about once a month for dinner at my and Jill's apartment, and the other weeks we would either meeting at the Starbucks on Wake Forest campus so that students could bring their friends, and it was a very kind of a social place. We can invite people in. We got to know the baristas really well and got to share the gospel with them. But we also did things like we would once a month we would say we're taking the night off, and in twos we would go and hang out and do something together with lost friends. So, for instance, one of the other master's student from Wake, he and I would go play trivia with one of his lost friends, or we would go play something else with some of mine. So he and I would do those things together once a month just to get us around our lost friends, and together we could share the gospel with people. So it's kind of a 2x2 type of idea that we saw from Luke 10. So anyways, I think that's really one of the great strengths, is that it builds community for everyone. It's really good at raising up new leaders, as many of the other models are, because you're giving, people are in charge of different things, so they get to use their gifting. It's also, I think, one of the best strengths is that it's multiplication and context oriented. So a missional community really strives to say, how can we be the best gospel expression for this community or this specific group? So a lot of missional communities will almost adopt a part of the city, or they'll adopt a school, or they'll adopt some type of subcultural group or something. You have missional communities that will start in bars and pubs and those type of things, because they want to minister to people who are coming in getting drunk, and they just start meeting there together, not to drink necessarily, but to just share the gospel. Or some are meeting with sports leagues or different things. So the idea is that they're context oriented. They want to do, as a group, do what's best for that particular area. So almost like adopt a people group to engage very specifically, which I think is a great strength. And they also operate as a group on mission together. So a lot of everything we do is together, because of the rhythm of life and different things that they're including. Some of the weaknesses, though, sometimes missional is in name only. You can have it. We're a missional community, but we only do 2-hour Bible study every week. That's not a missional community. So right now, because it's kind of a newer idea, newer concept, there's a lot of different books written about it. I wouldn't recommend reading all the books. I'd recommend just maybe reading one or two. Or maybe finding a church that does it well, just learning from them. But sometimes this idea of being missional and saying, well, we call them missional communities, but we're not really doing anything on mission together. Well, you just need to reassess. Call them something different. Call them a life group or community group, or whatever else you want to call them. But if you want to do missional community, the idea of a missional community, that it is a group of people living on mission together in the mess of life. And so I would just, and missional gets thrown around with everything. So just be careful with that. They can also, some of the ways they can become just a weekly Bible study if you're not intentional, not careful. Could have that potential for power struggle, because the MC leader does have some pastoral responsibility. And evangelism is not group's responsibility, but only the individuals. That's not even right. Evangelism is not group's. I'm sorry, I copy and pasted that wrong. It was another late night. But anyways, one of the weaknesses is that there could be some power struggles. But you want to make sure your evangelism is as a group. In final analysis, I would say that it's great for hybrid churches attempting to balance all aspects of church life and desiring to exist for the lost. If your church really says, we want to be for the lost, we want to plant from the harvest, be intentional with that, it's not going to grow your church very fast. Missional community churches typically do not grow very fast. They don't do the lunch large. They don't have 300 people in a public worship service. They try to have different communities, and as they have 3 or 4 different missional communities meeting in different places throughout the city or the community, then they start meeting together on Sunday morning for the gathering time. But these are kind of hybrid churches. They're kind of figuring out, they're kind of doing some both and. They're doing Sunday morning well, they're doing small group time well. But they really desire and exist for the sake of the lost. And so that's why the missional communities are often very open and inclusive to lost people, and they're structured that way. Leaders are trained to do that. So as we wrap up, benefits of starting small groups early. We've gone through some 5 different approaches or ways to do it. So here's why, I think here's the benefits of starting them early on and not starting starting after the church is launched. If you let's have a Sunday morning worship service and then get people into small groups, well then who are going to be your leaders if you haven't already trained them inside of a small group environment? So here are the benefits. I think first of all, it builds a disciple-making culture. It lets people know that this is normal. Being part of these small groups and being intimate with other believers and learning and accountability of these things, whichever approach you choose, whichever is best for your city, your context, it builds a disciple-making culture. And the small group format is just a structural tool. It's not the end all. Missional community is not better than life group. Life transformation group is not better than Sunday school, and vice versa. All of those can build disciple-making culture if you do it very intentionally. I think it also models leadership development early on. Unless you're those who are part of your core team or your launch team, whichever you want to call them, it models how to lead because they're giving leadership responsibility. Hopefully you have more than one small group that's meeting before your big launch day, and you've got multiple people who have to lead those. You as the church planting pastor can't lead 4 different groups, but you've got others, so you're able to model that leadership and raise up those leaders early on, so then it's expected that we multiply and develop leaders. It establishes church structure. And as we discussed with, if you have a building, if you don't have a building, really the small groups really define. So if our church structure is not dependent on a building, then the life or community group or the missional communities really work well with cell groups because we don't need a church building. So it really helps with your church structure as far as what your church is going to look like on a week-to-week basis. We meet together on Sunday morning. We have Sunday school right before. Well, Sunday school really establishes that church structure because then, okay, so what's going on during the week? Is anything happening on Tuesday or Wednesday, or is nothing happening? Okay. Or is that more of a ministry night for the church? There's different ways. So it really helps establish your church structure by nailing down pretty soon what's the best way to do small group discipleship here in our context. And I think it also helps decide on launch day. If you're doing more of a life or community group, then you can go ahead and kind of pick out your launch day and go ahead and nail that down because your small groups will start either right before or right after that. And so it kind of helps decide that. If you're doing more of a missional community approach, then your launch day may be a little more fluid. It may be a little more flexible because you may say, well, we're not going to launch until we have 4 missional communities who are getting together, and then we'll start meeting together on Sunday morning. Well, then you probably don't want to say, we're going to start on April 4th of 2018 as our launch day. We may only have 2 missional communities by that point. So it kind of affects your launch day as well. So I think it's something as a team for you to discuss and to learn from other churches. I would do your homework. What have other churches in our context? What's been the best way for them to do small group discipleship? Is Sunday school the best, or is home groups the best? Or do missional communities work here, or do they not work here? What's the history of small group life here in the city from the various churches? Learn those things, and then say, okay, how has God wired me, and how has God wired our team, and what's the best way to do small groups? So I hope that this conversation has helped you some as you've moved in, you've made disciples, you've given them to small groups, and we are preparing. We are in pre-launch. We are getting ready to launch this church for its first public worship service. We're still doing a lot of church things before that day ever happens.